Dear Professor Sadler, thank you very much for coming in on a Saturday morning. How are you?
I'm good, and thanks for having me on.
You're very welcome. I'm just going to start this with like a preface in terms of my preparation for the podcast itself. Once I contacted you at first, like the immediate ideas that I wanted us to talk about and to discuss were the ideas of the absurd and the ideas of ethics and morale across the whole philosophical spectrum. But as I was thinking a little bit more of it, so as to like what people would actually, where people would actually get the most benefits from, I kind of figured that it wouldn't really be the absurd. It wouldn't be really from too much philosophizing about the ethics, but it would be something that could combine both, the thought process and the actions themselves. That's how I came, and this is just my suggestion for us to talk about Stoicism, precisely about the two themes that I believe people will find most interesting, and that is the dichotomy of control in our lives, and also, as Seneca would put it, the shortness of life, or the memento mori concept.
Okay.
Before we start with that, I'm really interested in actually knowing about your own background. Everybody has their own reasons, I believe, so as to why they got interested in philosophy, to whichever degree it may be. Can you recall what were the things or the ideas that got you first into studying philosophy, and then bringing up philosophy to the level from your perspective that you are doing today?
Well, it may be disappointing for some of your viewers and listeners, but many of the points were less like a deliberate decision and more just kind of wandering into something and being fortunate, hitting the right thing at the right time. So, I was always interested in what later on I understood as philosophical questions from being a kid. What things are made of, and how do we know whether things are true or false, and what's right and wrong. And I was always making arguments. So my mother was convinced that I should be a lawyer because I like to argue so much. And, I think the first philosophy book I ever had my hands on was the Camus' Myth of Sisyphus, because my uncle had it. And I thought it was about Greek mythology, which I was interested in at the time. Okay. So I said, "Can I have this?" And he said, "Yeah, you go ahead. I can't make heads or tails of it." And so I started reading it, and I maybe understood a tenth of what was going on. I think I was around 14 or so, and then I took enough. And then I took a philosophy class in high school, and it was terrible. And the teacher was awful, and the textbook that we had to use was very boring. And then we had another class that effectively turned into a philosophy class. I was at a Catholic high school, so it was supposed to be a sacraments class. And the guy who was brought in to teach it, Mr. Lorenzo, he said, "Well, I'm going to teach you about Augustine. And in order to teach you Augustine, I've got to teach you some Plato and Aristotle and some other things." And so I liked that. And, I got to know those names at least. And then in high school, I was also reading some other things that veered into existentialist philosophy. Didn't do anything in a systematic way. And then I went in the Army, and I bought a sort of summary philosophy book while I was in there. But we were always having philosophical conversations, about the nature of things, or what was right, or epistemological questions. And then I got out, and I was working in restaurants, and I decided, well, this isn't any good. I'm going to go to college. So being effectively a first-generation college student, I had no idea how the system worked. Mm-hmm. So I just took the first place that gave me money and went there. And my mom's boyfriend at the time said, when you get to college, declare your field of study, what we call a major here in the United States, right? And so I looked down the list, and I saw philosophy. I was like, well, that sounds cool. I'll do that. And so they just started putting me in philosophy classes, and I enjoyed it. And the place that I was going to wasn't the professors weren't particularly well informed about the nature of philosophy, but I read around a lot. And then I after taking a year off and working on languages and working as a security guard, I once again applied to graduate schools and took the first place that gave me some money. Went down to Southern Illinois and just started taking classes. doing things that I found interesting. And so you can't say that I really had any sort of coherent research program, except when it came to languages. And I knew I wanted to do philosophy of language back then. I didn't have any sort of coherent plan of study until late in graduate school. And then the things I've done subsequently, like getting involved with the modern Stoicism movement or doing the work on the Christian philosophy debates, that all came out later. And I had to kind of learn how to be a researcher.
A little bit later.
Yeah, and it was okay, because I think a lot of the time when you learn things on your own, there's a lot of people who can't do that. They want a lot of guidance. But if you're the kind of person who likes to learn things on your own, having too much guidance can actually be a bad thing, because then you learn how to do it this way, but you don't really learn how to do it in multiple ways. And a lot of things that you do as a researcher are just kind of, digging around and seeing what's there. It's sort of like being an archaeologist. You don't just dig in the one place they tell you to dig. You dig all over the place, and then you see what bones you come up with and start working with it. Yeah. So it's like I said, it's kind of a disappointing story, because there isn't any special turning point, like I read Marcus Aurelius and it turned my life around, or any sort of thing like that, like people usually say. But different people have different stories, I guess you could say.
Yeah, of course. But I mean, any story, and yours included, is very interesting. But in terms of, like, as you were mentioning beforehand, in terms of learning specific things, the person that liked, so this is just a thought that doesn't have anything to do with anything else, or it has actually. It's like when you want guidance, specifically speaking, in learning anything, you're obviously moving, in my opinion, towards like some sort of a concrete goal. So you have some sort of a goal, concrete one in mind, and you really want guidance towards it. Whereas when you're approaching something from like a curiosity worldview, like you have perhaps until like that point when you had to do some research, it was like, okay, I'm going to take everything inside, and only after that did the goal itself perhaps manifest.
Yeah, and I'll say there's a third kind as well, where you start out with some clearly defined goals, and it turns out that your goals were actually the wrong goals to have, but you discover that in the process of studying whatever it is that you're studying. So, like, I'll give you an example. My daughter, as a young girl, started taking ballet, and she, there's a certain kind of body type for being a ballerina, and it also doesn't help if you have ankles that overpronate, because you have to go on point and all that sort of stuff. And she was really into ballet, and she really wanted to do ballet. And we were like, well, do you want to try to do jazz or tap and she was like, yeah, I'll try tap. I'm not interested in jazz or this other stuff. And then she grew, and she grew into a body type that is really well suited for other kinds of dance. She's very powerful, but that's not what they want in ballerinas, right? They want little tiny things. And so, her goal originally was to be this kind of thing. And then she discovered that she could also be very good at something else that would, in fact, replace the older goals. And I think a lot of our life is like that. We tell a lot of stories, now that I'm thinking about it, in movies and novels, where we start out with one set of goals, and then we discover that gets us somewhere. But it gets us to the place where we can now see what we really need to do.
Yeah, it gives the perspectives, it gives the knowledge, actually. And I believe that in most cases, that's exactly what matters, because the goal, whichever it may be, is going to get accomplished. You feel good 5 minutes later on, and then you're on to something else. Whereas the knowledge you gain, whereas the experiences you have, you can really not only carry with yourself throughout the following years and decades, hopefully, but also transfer it to other people. You mentioned something about the learning process and learning ideas along the way. Which were the ideas then, once you actually understood that philosophy was the thing for you? Which were the ideas that influenced you perhaps the most up until this day? I know there's a lot of them. I know that there have probably been several phases that you've gone through, but looking at it deductively, which ideas were they?
I've always been attracted to the practical application of philosophy, and that's made me a bit different than most of my peers, who are happy to, kick ideas around and maybe look at the application later on, or maybe never do that. I'm always saying, well, if we take on, say, Camus, or we take on Nietzsche, or we take on Descartes, what does the world look like? What kind of people are we? How should we act? How should we implement this? So I've always been interested in what they nowadays call philosophy as a way of life. And I realized that I could actually make some difference with that when I was talking with a colleague. And this is down at Fayetteville State University, where I was for about 3 years during the economic crisis, starting in 2008. So, you got to a place, you held on to it, And I had a colleague, and she was in the Spanish department, and she was complaining about her colleagues and how they were treating her badly. And they were actually treating her badly, gossiping about her and being mean and stuff like that. And there was a passage, I was doing a lot of work on St. Anselm at the time, and there was a passage in one of his letters where he was giving counsel to somebody. And I was like, well, St. Anselm says this and this and this about that, and here's how it fits your situation. And it was, it was very helpful for her. And I realized that most people, they could find the philosophical ideas or passages that could be helpful for them to understand their situation, or to provide some consolation, or to figure out what they should do next, what steps they should take. But for some reason, there's always a disconnect, and I think maybe it's because most people think of philosophy as something just very abstract and not connected to their lives, because they take an intro to philosophy class, and it's a teacher who's kind of a jerk, and that's a whole other story. So anyway, I realized with this and with other experiences that philosophy, I was already using it in my own life, but it could be very helpful for other people, and that's what made me receptive to the idea later on of getting certified as a philosophical counselor. Because I was already doing that work sort of impromptu and not getting paid for it. And I was like, well, I could do this professionally. And then, that like everything else, that opened up other doors as well, and drew me into other directions. But that was one important moment. I'll tell you about another really funny one. So, I mentioned I was really into philosophy of language. And when I first got to graduate school, that's all I wanted to do. And so I was doing the side of studying languages, and the side of like delving into philosophy of language. So in continental philosophy at that time, the cutting edge stuff was people like Derrida, or in American stuff, semiotics. And so I was doing all that stuff all the time. And I had a guy who came up to me and he was very angry with me. And I'm not sure how we got into the conversation, but at one point he like shouted at me and he says, "You think everything is language?" And I was like, well, no, I don't. I mean, I think that language, you can't get away from it, right? So it's very important to study it. But I don't think that everything is language. And then I thought, well, how does he have that idea that that's what I think? And so I'm putting myself into his perspective, trying to figure out, trying to reconstruct, how did this go wrong? So wrong that he thinks that I've got this crazy belief, that we aren't actual human beings. We're just like language talking to itself. And so that was kind of a useful moment for me to realize that, I'd already known that philosophers are not more rational than other people, because I'd see them get in shouting matches with each other over papers and stuff like that. But that really drove it home to me that people can like totally misinterpret you, and there's not an awful lot you can do about it. Actually, that would be a good jump into the dichotomy of control if you want.
Sure, why not? Let's follow the thread.
I mean, one key aspect of that, and Epictetus, who's the person who originates this, although he doesn't use the word dichotomy of control, that's later people. He just talks about what's in your power, what's not in your power, what's your business. What other people think of us is to some degree we can influence it, but we have zero control over it. I mean, anybody can take anything out of context, and especially in our day, right? We could take this interview right here.
Yeah, chop it up.
Well, and now we have that deep fake software, right? So we could make you, I don't know, Obama and me, Trump, and change the words, change the timbre of our voice. There's all these crazy things that can be done with a person's image. So yeah, you have almost no control over that. Doesn't mean that you don't have any influence. So like if I come to the interview and I'm like, totally drunk at so it's now 9:47 in the morning, and you see me just like, dropping stuff all over the place. That's obviously not going to make a good impression, right?
Yeah.
I have control over that, but I could dress up in a suit and tie, and you could be like, oh, look at that bourgeois guy, who's he trying to impress? So that's just one aspect of the dichotomy of control. So there's two sides, right? I can choose what I put on. I can choose to have the mic set up properly. Zoom could screw us over.
Yes, exactly.
The interview could end immediately.
Or life could end immediately. Or
exactly. Yeah.
So one of those things. You mentioned something earlier, like in terms of the languages, and let's just put it like Stoicism a little bit to a sidetrack. When I was like, I'm not sure how it is in terms of like the American high schools, or whether or not there's a difference between the private high schools and the public ones. But I mean, I was finishing public. I mean, there aren't a lot of private high schools in general here in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and generally in the Balkan region. But I was finishing high school, and at the end of high school, everybody has to write like their own sort of like graduate paper. It's not something, it's not
like a thesis.
Right, basically like a high school thesis. And I chose a philosophical question like, does language make us think the way we do? Because I had a really extremely interesting and good professor of philosophy in high school, Sajida. This is my regards to her. And I chose that subject because I remember reading Orwell's 1984, and I remember his concept of newspeak. And it's if I just want to know like your personal opinion, like deducted from everything that you read and done research. It's like, does it really, and would it really make an impact if we, for example, did not know the word for love? If we did not know the word for love, would we be able to conceptualize what love is, and would we actually be able to feel it in the way that we think of it now?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, I think that it's one of those things where we would eventually have to come up with a term for it. When you look at some ancient philosophers who are talking about emotions and talking about other things in moral life, like Aristotle, he'll actually say, well, there isn't a word for this, but this must be the case, right? And he'll identify things. So he's actually a very good phenomenologist. A lot of people don't think of Aristotle that way, but he's doing sort of a phenomenology of moral life. And now, there is something that you're really getting at, though. If you don't have the way of articulating something, you could say ready at hand, it's a lot harder to make sense of that experience or that emotion. And that's why like Americans love, because we're so illiterate when it comes to most other languages. And actually, high school, people do study languages often in high school, and they'll do like 4 years of Spanish or French, and they can't have a conversation, because they're not actually using it. But they're fascinated with these lists of like foreign names for emotions or experiences, like Schadenfreude, right? A German thing, taking pleasure in somebody else's bad experience. Okay, so we have names for that, but it's cooler if it's in a different language.
It sounds better.
And I think it also makes it more identifiable for people, and we have all sorts of loan words like that. English is actually one of the languages that has borrowed the most from everybody else. If we see a term that we like, we suck it in.
Just take it in.
Exactly. So, we even have things like, there's a certain je ne sais quoi, right? A certain I don't know, and people will use that term without knowing what it is. Actually, I'll tell you about another silly thing. So, we have sandwiches, beef sandwiches, and you can get them au jus, which means with its sauce or juice, right? And au jus has come to name a certain kind of sauce now in English. So it's served, instead of being served au jus, which would be the proper way to talk about it, we say it's served with au jus sauce. And
okay.
People, so things take on a certain life of their own, right? And for me, as a French speaker, I kind of rankle at that, but it's become the norm. So I don't want to become the old man, the proverbial old man shouting at a cloud from The Simpsons, right?
Yes.
Kicking against a term that is now part of the vocabulary. But you're right. So if we have terms for things, we can refer to them and experience them and identify them. So a lot of this is a bit off track, but a lot of work in counseling and therapy is helping people to be able to give names to their emotions, names that they can perfectly well apply to other people's emotions, but can't apply to their own. Like being able to understand that one is angry, and then you can start tapping it. Well, what are you angry about? And so we could do this with love too, or affection. I mean, there are many words for love, right? I don't buy into the Greeks had 4 different names for it. That's all BS. That's warmed over C.S. Lewis that no classic scholar actually believes, because when you read the Symposium, you see them like mixing together these words, eros and agape and all that. But there is something to having a larger vocabulary, to being able to describe nuances, and that's where poetry is very helpful, right? Or literature. Maybe more than philosophy at sometimes.
Yeah, but you make a really good point in terms of the psychological counseling as well. And I mean, this is also, I assume, a big part of the philosophical counseling work that you do via ReasonIO. And it's like basically helping people identify things and look at it from a perspective that they haven't actually taken on before, whether or not it's through psychology and being actually able to, for the lack of better terms, or perhaps the best term to use, through naming a problem. Because if you were lost in the anxiousness or whatever else, as soon as you identify the problem, you can tackle it. Whereas if you don't, you're just, treading all over the place. And okay, so in terms of the philosophical counseling that you do, what do you like, which is, I'm not sure whether or not I'm gonna actually phrase this properly, but what do you, from your own experience, what have you from your own experience seen that has helped people the most? Like which philosophical field? Was it Stoicism? Was it something, was it existentialism? What, like, which area do you think
which
helps
movement,
people the most?
right?
Yes, the movement.
Yeah, it's actually not a particular movement as such, and I adopt a kind of eclectic approach that I'll tell you about in a moment. It's instead a really simple insight, and it sounds almost like, well, of course that's the case, but telling people that what they're going through is not unique and that many other people have had to deal with it is so liberating to so many people. And I guess it makes sense if you think about it, right? You feel like your own problems are your own, they're unique, and nobody else can really address them. And then you say, oh, no, people deal with that kind of anxiety all the time. Here's how we talk about it, and here's the approaches that we take to it. You can see like people, I do a lot of it through Zoom and through Skype, you can see their bodies relax when you tell them that. Not always right away. Sometimes it has to kind of sink in, but that is probably the most helpful thing. And I've seen that work in group work as well. Like when we have these online, we do like the Stoic Fellowship, and we do an organization called Filozofija, which is the Society of Philosophers in America. And these issues will come up as well. And it doesn't have to be me saying it. It can be somebody else saying, hey, I go through that, or somebody else has written about that. So realizing that you're not alone is probably the biggest thing. Now, which approach is going to be helpful? It really depends on the person, and I'm competent to help people with some of them, but not all of them. So like I can, if they want to work on things using Stoic ideas and practices, I can do that, or Aristotelian or existentialist. But if they have something else that's drawn from some other tradition that they're really into, I may or may not be conversant with it, So I think I'm a big believer in people should seek out the others, whether it's medical professionals or psychological therapists or philosophical counselors, they should seek out the people that will help them the most, and they should be very pragmatic about it. If they go into a session and they're 10 sessions in and they haven't seen any progress, they should say, nope, we're done with this. It shouldn't be like that interminable thing where people would be in analysis for 5 years or something.
Yeah, without any resolution.
Yeah. I mean, I think, and that's one of the good things about the philosophical counseling movement. At the very beginning, in the initial session, at least the way that the APPA does it, you determine whether you're likely to be able to make progress together. And if not, you're supposed to, as a counselor, tell the person and don't lead them on into further sessions, and then also say, hey, if I can refer you to somebody else who can be more helpful for you, here's their number, here's their information. And the similar thing happens in psychological counseling here in the United States, but it takes much longer. It's much more formalized. But yeah, so I've seen a lot of people benefit by bringing in Stoic insights. I've seen a lot of people benefit by taking more Aristotelian or Platonic views on things. And it's really up to the client to decide what they want to do. I can give advice, Again, we come back to the dichotomy of control, right? It's not like I can reach into somebody's brain and turn things around and be like, there you go, you're fixed.
You can basically notice what's at hand and what can be applied, but only and this is one of the earlier podcast episodes that I was talking with Dr. Lewis. He is a psychologist from Great Britain, and he basically says he doesn't view the relationship between the psychologist and the client as a relationship between a doctor and a patient, because really he isn't healing anything. It's the patient or the client that has the capability to heal himself or herself, whereas the psychologist is there to guide him, to show him what could be used, what could be used on a shorter term, where in contrast to something that would take them a much longer path. So let's take that dichotomy of control into perspective, because the idea that you're putting out now in terms of people figuring out that they are not alone in their own troubles is so obvious, but it's so obvious only when somebody else tells you about it. And another thing that's so obvious is that you cannot control everything, but you actually need somebody to tell you that in order to feel less anxious.
Yeah, I think you're right there, that we benefit. So this can go back to sort of a philosophical basis. When we talk about human beings as being rational beings, as in Greek, the logike zone, that Aristotle talks about, there's the side of cognitive processes, we can think things out, we can do problem solving better than other animals, we develop technology and all that. But there's also logos, means speech. And within speech, you don't have speech with just one person and then, somebody else ambles along and then picks it up. It's always dialogical. Even if you're just by yourself talking to yourself, you're sort of using that almost parasitically, as if you're talking to another person. And within speech, we can signify, as Aristotle says in Politics, Book 1, things that go beyond mere animality. We can talk about the just and the unjust, or the helpful and harmful, and we can talk about this whole range of things that in Greek is really simple. The kalon and the eistron could be the beautiful or fine or noble or honorable, and then it's opposite. And in the rhetoric, he says, in the politics, he says we form agreements on these. In the rhetoric, he says these are the things we disagree about. So we have this vast field, right? And so every interaction that we're having, even if it seems very trivial, has the potential to be a distinctively human communicative interaction and have this richness to it. And very often a lot of ambiguity, where somebody can go one way or go another way. And when we're doing psychological counseling or philosophical counseling, or even just talking with a friend about our problems over beers at the bar or something, we are engaging in this process where breakthroughs could take place. where insights could happen. And very often we do need to get them from other people. You know, as the practitioner, I'm not most of the time using my own stuff. I'm using everybody else's stuff, right? So I won't say I'm channeling Aristotle. That's a little bit too pretentious, right? But I'm drawing upon what Aristotle has to say, or Epictetus has to say, or Gabriel Marcel has to say, and saying, oh, well, this might be useful for you. And so the person could do that on their own, and quite a few people will read, say, Seneca and read it thoroughly and be like, yeah, okay, I can apply this to my own life. I don't need somebody else coming in. But that's because they used Seneca as that somebody else coming in, right? So we do have a lot of choice about like who we listen to. I guess, I mean, now that I think about my own past, I was pretty stubborn and didn't listen to a lot of people when I should have. But, you know, things turned out okay. That makes me a little bit more sympathetic to my students when they don't want to listen to me.
You can feel it from their shoes.
Yeah, I know what I was like, you know. So I'm not so tempted to think that, you know, human nature is fundamentally changed in a generation.
Yes, as some people do.
Yeah, I think a lot of instructors do. They forget what it was like to be a student. But coming back to the point, yeah, a lot of people, they benefit from hearing something that they could have found themselves, but they just didn't happen to do so. And maybe it's saving them some time, or maybe it's putting it into a systematic way. And I think part of what goes on too is it's, you know, being heard by the other person. It has a value in itself. And then there's a certain kind of accountability. You know, if you and I have a number of sessions and you're still talking about the same thing and doing the same things as you did in session one, I'll probably call you on that and be like, hey, how come things are not changing? You know, you claim to have these insights that you're now armed with and you think they're so wonderful, but you're not applying any of them. What's going on here? And then we start probing into that. So I think the dialogical situation is really important, which also means too that if you have a bad practitioner, that can really screw people up.
Yeah.
We're vulnerable to getting the wrong messages, or towards being sucked into exploitative or abusive relationships. You know, think about like the teacher who just wants to get on the stage and talk at their students, you know, for an hour, and the students have to like take all the notes and they don't get anything out of it. I've had quite a few teachers like that.
Yeah,
that's exploitative, really. It's not exploitative in terms of money, but it's exploitative in other ways.
Much more long-term ways. And
yeah.
So you also mentioned, you know, taking certain advice and then not applying it in the person's life. In terms of like, okay, so let's say that you determined that a certain person would benefit from some sort of Stoic insights. What so this is yet again like a really general question, and of course it depends on the person to person, but let's frame it as if it were like directed to a singular individual. What are like what do you think are like the insights that most people would benefit that are taken from the Stoic philosophy? Is it is it the insights that stem from the Epictetus, you know, like dividing things into the things that we do have control and the things we do not have control over, or is it that with some other things?
That's a great question. So I think, and there's disagreement among people within the modern Stoic community about this, but I think that Stoicism is essentially like a vast network of ideas, like a web. And it's strongest when you have all of the parts of the web in there. They reinforce each other. So I'm very critical of what we can call Lifehack Stoicism, where you get your little pamphlet with 10 principles, and now you've got everything that you need. Yeah, and I think that it's important to go back and read classic Stoic authors, even if it feels kind of boring or fruitless. That changes over time. So actually reading Seneca, reading Marcus Aurelius, reading Epictetus, maybe going beyond them to other sources as well. But even if you just like get one of them down all the way, you see these interconnections. So the dichotomy of control a lot of people get themselves in trouble with it because they treat it as this absolute that we can apply to every single thing without thinking about it, right? Without framing it in terms of other principles or other insights. And so, yeah, I think I'm definitely on the side of you need a lot more tools in your toolbox, and you need to have some practical experience in which tool to use. I mean, it's, if we want to use this tool metaphor, right? So having the dichotomy of control and just that is like being the person who's got a hammer and then tries to fix everything with a hammer.
Yes.
Some things you can fix with a hammer.
A lot
Other
of you
things,
can't.
yeah. I mean, if you need a screwdriver, you can hammer a screw in, but you're going to screw things up. And then, so you get a bigger box of tools, right? Actually, that's kind of a funny thing. As a guy, one of the things when people don't know what to give you for Christmas presents, they give you tools. That's a thing here in the United States. I don't know if it's like that in the Balkans, but and so I've got way more tools than I can ever use, and every once in a while I get rid of some, I give them to somebody else, so I'm just passing the problem down the field, essentially. You don't really need that many tools, but you do need to know which tool to use. And there's no tool that, there's not like a little, indicator that you can go into the toolbox with, almost like the Star Trek tricorder, and it'll say, yes, use the hammer now, or something. That's got to be up here. You gotta figure that out. And I don't think that you can get that from the bullet point lists or anything like that, right? That's where it's really helpful to look at Epictetus and what he said to people, or Seneca and what he wrote in his letters to people, or Marcus is writing to himself, but much of his advice tends to be pretty useful for the rest of us as well.
I think actually Marcus was like the first introductory person, or the book, actually his meditations, that got me into like philosophy in general.
Oh,
I think
really?
it was like, I think it was like
was that in like middle school or high school, or?
That was so we basically have elementary, high school, like elementary school, high school, and then you have university, like undergraduate, postgraduate, and of course for the PhD. But it's like, I think like I read Marcus before my philosophy classes. I remember I still have a really good friend, Ariel is his name. I remember us like training. We were into like calisthenics and street workout stuff. And I remember us like training and talking about some really philosophical questions in the second grade of high school. Whereas in the third grade, I think, and I do not believe this was actually tightly connected to the class of philosophy, but it was tied, I think, yet again to our like mother language, or I cannot actually remember. I remember reading in the third grade Camus. I remember reading his Myth of Sisyphus. I remember, and I still like my hair stands up still when I remember like the last page and the last sentence, I believe, like, basically saying in the book, like the struggle itself is enough for a person to feel fulfilled, to feel happy. But the Marcus's sort of philosophy, like not Marcus's, but the Stoicism itself, is something that struck and still strikes like most in accordance with the worldviews that I see, and like and things of that nature.
Yeah,
I know.
Well, it's interesting because there's a lot of people who will bring up this question over and over again, like in the Facebook forums. They'll say, "Is Stoicism compatible with existentialism?" And then you got to say, well, which existentialists are you talking about? Because existentialism is kind of a broad movement, and Camus himself said, "I'm not an existentialist," but he can definitely be put into like the broad existentialist movement. And one of the things that I think where there's a big connection. So Camus, when he talks about the absurd, he says it's not the world itself that's absurd. The absurd is this triadic relationship between us, the kind of beings that we are, and we have this nostalgia for an order and meaning that never existed. We want things to be rational, including ourselves. We have this deep desire, and then there's the world that we encounter. And
it's in the interaction. between
Exactly. Yeah. And so Stoicism is really saying much of the same stuff. We have this rational nature. It's kind of screwed. None of us are the sage, so it's kind of screwed up in all of us, and we want crazy things that can't really be the case, like to snap my fingers and have $1 million, or with people my age, very often they have a midlife crisis, and they want to be younger or recapture something or have made different decisions. And those can be, we talk about that as like an existentialist crisis. We could also talk about that as a Stoic crisis too. So they're really on the same page in many respects with that. And then they'll have like different approaches. Well, here's what you should do in that case. And then the existentialist might say, yeah, some of that's useful and some of that's not useful. And there'll be, as with any movements, there'll be some places where you can't bring them completely together, and you do have to make some choices between them. And I think that's perfectly fine, and it's good to acknowledge those division points. Otherwise, Stoicism just would be existentialism. They'd be exactly the same movement, And I think it's fine for people to sort of pick and choose. There's two real ways to do that. When I was talking about eclecticism, one is what we call, and this is taken from I think a Norse word, smorgasbord. We use that a lot here in this part of the United States. It means like a buffet, right? Where you have all these things laid out, and you get to pick and choose whatever you want and put it on your plate, and then you eat that. And so some people look at eclecticism in philosophy as if, well, you just take a little bit of this and a little bit of this and a little bit of this, and you can do that. But you're not going to have any overall approach or system that really does anything for you. The other way to do it is more like what we call Ciceronian eclecticism, where Cicero studied with some of the best representatives of the philosophical schools of his time. And then he would take like whole parts of their philosophy and say, okay, I like all of this, and then we're going to see if we can't fit it into this part over here, which is a more systematic approach. So you could take Stoicism and parts of existentialism and find ways to connect them up. At some points you're doing more Stoic stuff. At some points you're doing more existentialist stuff. Sometimes you're doing a mixture of both. You could mix other things in there if you wanted to as well.
But I believe like the really, really good connection point between the two is the question of like existentialism, of existence, of actually not existence. This is a wrong way to frame it. But it's like the question that interests me perhaps the most in terms of like the existentialist questions, but that I'm looking to apply through the reading of Stoics. And that is the question of death. Like I remember.
Oh yeah, right. Yeah,
I remember reading, but this was like a really long time ago, and it might be akin to something like to your first time reading Camus. I remember reading Ernest Becker's like The Denial of Death, and I remember like some passages like really shocking me with like the ways things truly are, whereas like I don't think I understood 90% of the book. But that book got me to read Seneca's letter. I believe it was to...
On the Shortness of Life?
Yes, on the Shortness of Life. And I believe, but I cannot remember, that Marcus Aurelius wrote about it as well in his Meditations.
Yeah, all the time. He was older than me at the time that he's writing it too. So.
Yeah, so it's like basically, I actually remember... What was the saying that Marcus wrote in it? I had a little notebook where I was writing things up, and I had so this is just like an off track. I had a little notebook when I was in the second year of college, where I was writing all of these quotes and ideas that would come to mind that I could, just pull out the notebook and remind myself of. And I remember like meeting my girlfriend and writing her name and surname wrongly into that notebook. And I was thinking like she gave me a wrong surname. And then like a good friend advised me to look her up on Google, and I figure out, okay, so this is, I've written it wrongly. So this is just like an off track. But I remember writing in that, it was from the Meditations. Seneca's quote was it's not that we have a short life, it's that we like spend it in wrong ways. And I cannot remember the Marcus's actual quote, but
yeah.
so just to backtrack, I'll remember it after after this conversation ends.
That's interesting though, because there is a corresponding thing in Camus' myth of Sisyphus, right? It's the ethics of quantity, where he's got that whole discussion, and he says it's not. And I don't remember the exact phrasing, but it's not the the number of years that you have. It's how many experiences you're having through that time, and how you can have two people that are living exactly the same life, exactly the same time, but one has a higher quantity of experiences, because they're paying attention to things, and the other one's just kind of going through. And part of that would be helped by like not paying attention to things that don't really matter. You only have a limited amount of attention, right? So like being obsessed with, threads in your jacket or something, that's probably a good way to waste your life.
Yes.
Or the popular thing here, a lot of guys now, facial hair is a big thing here in the United States for the younger people.
Here
and
as well.
They'll like have all sorts of oils that they put in their beard.
Right. In order to make it more dense and more longer. And I know.
Now caring about that sort of thing, unless that's your job, maybe it probably isn't worth, getting somebody's name right. Now that's something that's a bit more important though, right? Because they care if you get their name wrong, and
Yeah, but I mean, like, that's exactly the point. I feel like in terms of like the Seneca's letter on the shortness of life, it's like you need to pick the things that you're gonna focus your attention on, and it's basically like focus on the things that are worthwhile. And I think this actual combined yet again with the dichotomy of control, and this is where I think that these two ideas can actually translate very well into the current pandemic times. Is that they can be really used well in order to really lower the quantity of anxiety that people have about the present and what's going to happen tomorrow.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, there are people who are very germophobic to begin with, and then a pandemic happens, and they they go out like garbed, like everyone should wear a mask, right?
Of course.
Socially distanced, but you don't necessarily have to have like the fanciest mask. They all
the gas mask and everything.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Now here in Wisconsin, unfortunately, the problem that we have is people, and it's interesting. There's a lot of people. It became a political issue. There's a lot of people who, especially men, won't wear masks because they don't want to be perceived as being afraid or weak, right?
Yeah.
And so what is a greater sign of being afraid, being anxiety driven, than not wearing something because you're afraid of being looked at as being afraid?
Yeah, it's just a different like you're basically afraid from like the social repercussions, not from the disease itself.
Yeah. And so you see a lot of that here, unfortunately. And I imagine there's some of that everywhere else in the world as well. But so, you can control the things that you can control. Like we in our building, we have elevators. We live in an apartment building, and there's rules. You can only have 2 people in an elevator, unless it's like a family who knows each other, right? And the reason is because we want to minimize things, and everyone's supposed to wear a mask. And so, if my wife and I are in the elevator and somebody else is trying to get in, I'll say, stay out of the elevator. There's only 2 people in here. Yes. And then sometimes they get kind of pissy with me, and they're not happy about that. But I have a choice to say that. I don't. If they want to push into the elevator, I mean, I could push them out if I want to, but odds are I'm not going to. And I don't control what other people are going to do. If they want to stand too close, I can move away again, but that's about it, And then when I get home, I can, maybe wash my hands extra carefully or not. And then I'm done. Then I can get back to work and do the things that matter to me, rather than obsessing over, did I get sick? Have I breathed in enough of the virus to screw me up?
It's just tending to overfocus on things that you don't have control over.
Which a lot of it is what other people think or say or do. I mean, in some respects, again, we have to be pragmatic. I don't have to care if my neighbors buy into weird conspiracy theories, so long as they wear their masks. That's cool, you know.
Of course. Until it's like a matter of like the social and the interpersonal issue. And I mean, it also has a lot to do, and this is something that the friend that I was spoken about earlier and other friends that we, that use that, the group of friends that used to have these philosophical discussions. And we had like, it's like a pejorative, but it's also, it's not really a rude name for people that are, like the youngsters, we call them klošari here. It's like thugs, but thugs without much brain. It's like they're just drifting through life and they're being led by other people. We were like, we were calling them like people without self-awareness, and the thing is that lack of self-awareness in those young people, unfortunately, is just one extreme. But it seems to me like the most people aren't really self-aware of both the control they have over their, and the lack of control they have over their lives. But like, it provides for so much power once you get to that knowledge. Because my favorite book is from Viktor Frankl, his Man's Search for Meaning. And it's like the way that he coped in the most horrific of situations by taking on responsibility for the things he can take control of, and that's his thoughts, and that's his actually search for meaning, both in one day meeting his wife and finishing his work, is like really what life could and perhaps should for most people be about. It's like, take everything that you have, now dissect it into the things that you can control and the things that you cannot control. The first group, the things that you can control, take maximum ownership and responsibility for them and make it as perfect as possible, whether or not it's from like it's something to do with you, like for example, in terms of the knowledge that you're acquiring, whether or not it's in terms of the society, but other things, leave it behind, man, because like, what do I have from obsessively thinking and checking the news every minute of the day about the coronavirus, how many cases are there? Like, it doesn't bring anything. It takes away a lot. So it's a really potent idea.
I think you're right that most people at any given time, and I'm willing to say that this probably goes back way into history and across all cultures, are not paying much attention to what's really important for them. In part, and the reason why I can say this is because we see the same things being said by philosophers or other wisdom traditions across cultures and throughout history, right? So it's kind of a constant. And you can't compel anybody to really move down that path. All you can do is like put the resources there for them and be available, and maybe hold groups or things like that. And it's interesting because the response that I get most of the time, this is like on videos or in groups, or people like, oh, I had no idea this existed. And you're like, well, how the hell did you not know that was available? But, it doesn't do any good to say that. It's more like, the thing that helps is to say, well, glad you're here, and then a lot of people too will say, oh, it's too late for me. I'm 40 years old. I don't know if I can do this sort of thing. And it's sort of like, learning languages or doing mathematics. Americans, and you can tell me if this is the case in your country as well. They have this thing like, well, I could have done that back in my 20s and teens, but now I can't do it. And philosophy isn't like that. You can do it at any time. Obviously, you begin as a beginner. There's no like way to take shortcuts. But Epicurus said something like that you can start it at any time if you want to. It's not like, say, I don't know, playing soccer, right? That's a young man's thing. Well, or young woman's if they want to. And I love soccer, but I'm 50 years old. I'm not going to,
play
if you and I were to play, you're going to beat me.
I didn't touch the ball, like the soccer ball, for a really, really long time. So I wouldn't really bet on it for a long time.
But you see where that's going.
Yeah.
Things that have to do with the mind, particularly things that have to do with the way we're living our life, well, we can pick those up at any time,
Because we're nearing that 1 hour mark that we were talking about in terms of the podcast, I would like to latch on to this idea of building the mind through knowledge. You're obviously well-read. You have decades of reading behind yourself and decades of learning. What might be your advice for, because the target group of this podcast is predominantly young people?
Yeah.
What might be your advice, A, in the more general terms, in terms of acquiring knowledge, as much knowledge as possible, how to read, how to learn, and B, perhaps which philosophical works would you say are a must for every person to read?
Yeah, that second one is very tough. And I get a lot of questions from people who are quite anxious about, do I have to read this? Does it have to be in this order and all that? And I usually say, don't worry about it. Just read some texts and realize that you're going to have to reread them. And not just because you're not going to get everything at the start, but reading, say, Camus at 14, you pick up on different things than you do at 24, than you do at 44. I mean, if I had to pick like some must reads, I would say, Descartes' Meditations should be in there, even if you're not going to be a Cartesian, right? Epictetus's Discourses, maybe Plato's Symposium. I don't know. It's tough to say, because any one of them is giving you something that's valuable, right? That you might not get somewhere else. But you can't read everything. And I was kind of laughing when you're saying that I was well read, because in some respects I am, and in some respects I'm not. Nobody can read everything that's available, or even like retain it. So you're always doing kind of a selection process. And I would say to people, don't make yourself feel bad about what you haven't read. Just try to concentrate on getting something out of what you are reading. The other thing, going back to the first question, so you can read philosophy by going to the philosophy section in the library or the bookstore and buying books that are there. But you can also get philosophy in many other ways. So if you think about Albert Camus, he was both a philosopher who wrote, philosophical books like The Rebel and Myth of Sisyphus, and his Letters to a German Friend, but he also wrote novels and even a play or two, and you can get philosophy through those. Philip K. Dick is one of my favorite authors, as is Ursula K. Le Guin. Both of them are sci-fi fantasy authors, and there's more philosophy in their works. Same thing with like Dostoevsky, you can say. There's more philosophy contained in their works, either in the dialogues between the characters or what they're saying, than there is in some philosophy texts. And so you can get philosophy in a variety of different ways. It's something broad. It's not something that's just restricted to a particular discipline or section, right? It should, in fact, pervade the other sciences and disciplines. And any science or discipline that you're doing at a very high level, you inevitably start doing philosophy. You start asking, well, what am I actually doing here in mathematics, right?
Why?
Are numbers real?
Yeah. It's a totally different discussion. But okay,
that's the case too for business, I want to say too. Not just like, abstract things like mathematics. That's the same thing for doing counseling and business and advertising. If you're doing it at a really high level and you're asking ethical questions, epistemological questions, metaphysical questions, you're doing philosophy.
And that's where like not the ability, but the curiosity to read and acquire as much as possible, as you really dissected it well, in terms of not like just taking Wittgenstein or taking like Plato and trying to dissect it in terms of like philosophy in of itself. Just take Dostoevsky, take other like take novels that you have at least heard contain some philosophical value. Don't, and this is just my personal opinion, don't look online for the things that you're gonna find in the book until you read the book itself, because the things that the things that strike the chord with you at first are perhaps the most important in terms of like the seed that's gonna grow later on, and that seed can grow based on the water that you're gonna pour by reading like analysis from other people. But read the thing first and then look for analysis.
Yeah, that's a very good metaphor. I like that.
Okay. So Professor Sadler, it's been an hour. Thank you very much for the really interesting conversation. I hope there will be another opportunity to talk again.
Sure. Yeah.
Sure. Before we end, first of all, Merry Christmas. Happy New Year.
Merry Christmas to you and your family as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And that the 2021 is a lot better without, hopefully, alien invasions and like, I don't know, like maybe Plato will come, rise up from the dead in order to make sense of everything. Or better yet, Marcus Aurelius. That might be better. Before we end, do you have anything else to add?
Well, I'll play off of the Plato and Marcus Aurelius thing. We would want Marcus Aurelius because he actually understood how to exercise power and get things done.
Yes.
Whereas Plato, the one chance that he had, he just totally screwed it up.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Greg. And have a nice
You're very
day.
welcome.